Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 47 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a large, well-appointed kitchen in a spacious detached house in suburban Essex. It is neither night nor morning, sometime after 4 a.m. Maggie, 49, is standing at the hob in her dressing gown, slowly heating some milk in a saucepan. Gary, also 49, appears in the doorway, watches her. It's quiet for some time. They have a brief exchange about the milk before Gary asks Maggie, "What's wrong?" After some moments, she replies, "I'm not sure I love you anymore." So begins David Eldridge's new play, Middle, which as we record this episode is live on stage at the National Theatre in London. The play follows his wonderful play Beginning, which ran in the same theatre in 2017, and which I was privileged to talk with David about back in episode 11 of the podcast. As the name suggests, Middle is a follow-up to Beginning, and part of what David has now called a triptych for the theatre. It is not a direct sequel, however. More, it is a moment in the middle of a life and a marriage, at which, like so many of us who've reached this notional point, Maggie and Gary are asking questions about what they have done so far, what else they wish they'd done, and what more they want. Their personal soul-searching encompasses many of the common anxieties of both their time of life and of our age. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome David back again today to talk us through this next stage of this important dramatic trilogy he's building. Welcome, David. Great to see you again.
Likewise. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me back on the podcast. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. It's hard to imagine that many of our knowledgeable listeners will be unfamiliar with David's work, but as a brief reminder, his plays include Under a Blue Sky, Festin, Incomplete and Random Acts of Kindness, Market Boy, In Basildon, and The Knot of the Heart, to name just a few, as well as adaptations of Ibsen and Strindberg, including The Wild Duck and Miss Julie. David is also a lecturer in the Department of English, Theatre and Creative Writing at Birkbeck, University of London. So, David, following on from Beginning with a play named Middle, the logical assumption is that this is a sequel and the precursor to an ending. But as I've said, it's not actually strictly a sequel, is it? And you've described the play as the second of a loose trilogy of plays, or triptych, for the theatre. So my first question has to be, when you wrote Beginning, did you have the idea of a trilogy in mind? And then how would you define what connects the two plays so far and the concept of the trilogy?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, originally I didn't have a trilogy or triptych in mind at all. You know, I wrote Beginning, and I very much just saw that as a gesture in the theatre in itself, and that was it. What happened was that on the third preview of Beginning, back in October 2017 in the Dorfman, I had the image of Maggie and Gary on the stage in the middle of the night. So first off, I never ever was interested in the idea of doing a kind of a sequel.
So these two that you imagined were not older versions of Danny and Laura.
No, they're the characters that are in the play that you've seen. One of the things that I thought was really important about Beginning, and is important about Middle, and maybe will have a similar quality about the final play, is the sort of wondering what happens to the characters. You know, when the audience are leaving, and then when they're on the tube home or on the taxi home, on the drive home, or maybe if we've really touched some people, you know, maybe it's the following morning over breakfast or whenever, that people wonder about what's happened to the characters. And with Beginning, lots of people after the play, we found, were really invested in them and were like, well, has it been a one night stand or has it become more? Will she get pregnant? And I suppose what I saw then, as I was sitting there with the Beginning soundtrack playing, and I was waiting for that third preview to begin, was that you could look at a different kind of defining moment in the relationship of a couple, in effect the middle. So with a couple that are knocking 50 rather than knocking 40, and that are maybe reaching a kind of a crunch point. So it's not about are they going to get together? It's more like, are they literally going to break up in front of our eyes? Are they breaking up in front of our eyes? Where do they go next? Is the marriage going to survive because of this conversation? Or in a way, is this the kind of first big nail in the coffin? And this all sort of went through my mind. I had the image of Maggie heating the milk that you just described.
That popped into your head just like that.
Yeah, I mean, the images at the top and the tail of the play are always really important to me and are always there quite near the beginning of a process. And so then I realised, that in visual art, a triptych isn't always narratively linked. Often they're kind of thematically linked. If you look at like a Francis Bacon triptych, you're kind of slightly looking at an image from a different perspective. So I realised that I could maybe write these 3 plays that look at epochal moments in relationships, but that didn't have to be the same characters, that didn't have to be narratively linked, but that could share elements. So the plays that begin in the middle of the night or early hours, plays where there's an offstage daughter called Annabelle, plays where music and maybe dancing is important, maybe tidying up is important. And that just all ran through my mind. But literally the full stop on it, Doug, literally just before the 3rd preview of beginning began, was there's no point thinking much more about this until I have an idea for the final one.
So you're telling us that you do know what the end is.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't write middle until so that was like autumn 2017, and I didn't tell a soul about it. And then it was around 2 years later that I got the idea for the final play end. And I just remember thinking, oh, thank God, I can just write middle now. Because I was just holding middle in, I really wanted to write it, but I couldn't. I just wouldn't let myself because I wanted to feel 100% confident that I had a 3rd play in me. I've always felt over the years, Doug, that when I have an idea that won't go away, even if it's maybe seems a bit balmy initially, to pay attention to that. I think when you have something that bugs you, that itches away at you, that won't quite go, then that sort of thing is worth listening to. I suppose when you've got 3 couples rather than just 1 couple, then maybe you can end up saying something that's more than the sum of the 3 parts in a way, that they can all really exist independently. But equally, it will be lovely when end is there to do all 3 plays together so that an audience has the experience of, either dipping in and out or just getting the hit of the trilogy.
I love that these figures just popped into your head, that you saw them so clearly. And also those connections you've mentioned for anyone who knows beginning, all those lovely elements that you have in common, that a triptych also has in common in some way, doesn't it? And I love the idea, the analogy of the triptych, because you're thinking about it as 3 paintings or photographs, as you mentioned, like Francis Bacon, each of which perhaps represents a single moment in time as well, which is what you've just described, a defining moment in the lives of a couple, for example, but also a moment in time in the sense that both the plays so far are actually brief moments of real time, aren't they?
Yeah.
In the notes in the text, you say the play takes place in a real room and in real time. There are continuous conversations rolling out over up to a couple of hours, whatever, but in real time. Why do you choose such a contained focus as a structure for the play?
Well, because I think it's for a number of reasons, really. First of all, it's to do with the theatre of the gesture, which is that I think that what's really special about theatre is that you're all in a room together, sharing an experience,
And that it's live, right?
and that it's live, the performance and the audience together creating the play.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that if you do a play that is a single action for the whole of that evening, it's a very pure form of theatre. It's a very pure form of shared experience that you create because it's not broken by scene changes. It's just a continuous action, that you can share. And also because it's quite a rigorous sort of naturalism, as you say, played in real time, The audience and the performance are completely in sync. And so I really like that in this trilogy of plays that there's an opportunity to really, with the form of the play, something that I really believe in about the theatre, which is that you create something, a form of shared experience that's very pure. I think there's also another political reason for it, which is that the sort of people whose lives I'm dramatising in beginning and middle and that I have got in mind for the final play end, they're people that often don't get their lives looked at on stage. I mean, Laura in beginning is a little different. She kind of has a slightly sophisticated metropolitan feel, Laura, whereas the characters of Danny in beginning and the characters of Maggie and Gary are more, they're more suburban, they're more creatures of suburbia. And that's the kind of a world I know because it's a world I come from. It's lower middle class, working class made good, blue collar, clerical classes who have tried to, in the post war period, better the lives of their families, to have mortgages, to buy council houses. And these people, in my experience, by and large, don't get their stories told in the theatre. Akeborn has done it a bit, for sure. Sometimes they get their stories told on TV. And so I felt really strongly that when I wanted to look at my people on the stage in this trilogy, that it's in a form where you get to look at them in real detail. That, you know, doing a single action naturalistic play set in the middle of the night, time can almost feel like it slows down a bit and you really, really look at them in detail. So for me, it's really important politically, actually, with the small p, that in terms of telling the stories of these people and where they come from, that you really, you give them the stage in its entirety. You give them the whole focus of the audience for an hour and 40 minutes. So there's a mixture of reasons why I tell the story in the form that I do.
The idea of the audience and the performers and the act of theater sort of happening in the same breath, they're almost breathing with the same rhythm in this shared space.
Yeah,
And that there's no interruptions that allow an audience to switch their mind somewhere else at all. That has a real power. It also just rings true. It's very real and ordinary, even, which makes it authentic. It feels authentic. You were also saying about the type of people who are featured, the characters in this play, and where they come from, because locations obviously very important, is very specific, isn't it? You identify in the text that they are in Shenfield in Essex, and we see them in a relatively upmarket, well-appointed house. But you have references to Gary originally comes from Romford, does he? Or at least you mentioned that he worked in Romford Market, which I know you did. So I was going to ask you, how important is it for you to represent the voices of these people that come from where you come from, and obviously somewhere where you know?
well, of course, it's important. I mean, I think that everyone has their right to have their story told. I mean, over my working life in the theatre, which is scarily 26 years now, the theatre has become a much more open and diverse place, which is great. There are many more different and diverse stories told. There are many more plays produced by women. There are many more plays produced by Black and global majority writers. There are many more plays by LGBTQIA+ and queer writers. But I think that the thing that hasn't changed very much, actually, in the 26 years I've worked in the theatre, is that most of the people that make theatre and produce theatre are quite middle class. So there's a kind of a diversity of middle class voices in a strange way. And I think also you get, quite understandably, theatres are always looking for the story we've never heard before, from a world we've never heard from before. And I think that telling stories of my blue collar and aspirational people that are on the edges of cities, that are in the suburbs, in the dormitory towns, they're just kind of passed over, really. And of course, because I am of that world and my family all still live in that world, although I live in North London now, and in the heart of the Pesto Triangle.
It's not Crouch End, is it, David?
not in Crouch End, but I have an N8 postcode. But although I've kind of left there, all my family is from that world, and so I really want to write about that world. And I think there's another political point as well, which is that I think that instinctively theatres and the arts world can feel uncomfortable in the company of my characters because they're not necessarily liberal. They don't necessarily read The Guardian. They might not vote Green or for Keir Starmer.
They may have voted Brexit.
I think that the family in my play in Basildon definitely voted for Brexit. It's really important to me to tell the stories of those people that think about the world a bit differently to the world that I'm in. Because apart from anything else, most of our audiences are those people.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really important. You can hear the passion in my voice, I'm sure, to really tell those stories, not to overlook them.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Douglas Rintoul recently, who ran the Queen's Theatre in Hornchurch,
Yeah,
and we were talking similarly about what does theatre in an environment like that mean. And he was told at some point that you couldn't do drama in an area which is this sort of mixed or working class population. And we just thought, this is madness.
yeah,
Of course you can. But class in particular, as you say, is also one of the subjects or themes of the play, I think. Maggie and Gary, they come from, even between them, slightly different socioeconomic backgrounds.
yeah.
And this creates fissures, so to speak, in the rock of their marriage in a way that can weather and widen over time. And so not only are we seeing these type of people, but we're seeing also how awareness of their own class identity affects the way they behave and the way they think about their lives.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Maggie and Gary would, I think, in a lot of their representation in drama, be just lumped together. But you're quite right that they come from slightly different bits of the kind of C2s or the aspirational classes. In that Gary's parents were, really were working class. His dad was a bin man and his mum worked in Iceland, and they lived in a council house that they'd managed to buy, but everything was a struggle. Whereas Maggie, we find out that Maggie is a second generation EastEnder, a bit like I am. Her parents came from places in the East End of London, did well. Dad had his own business. Mum worked her way up in the NatWest Bank, managed to have a nice house in a nice bit of Romford called Gidea Park. So you're right. So they're aware that within this world of Romford, there are, of course, there's different class strata that everyone's aware of. Like what Gary says in the play about living a couple of miles apart, growing up a couple of miles apart, but it might as well have been a different universe. Well, that's true.
It's only a couple of miles away, but different enough. And I think that's part of the point. What's really interesting, David, is that it so informs their characters and the way they think of themselves. So Maggie comes from, as you said, a relatively comfortable background by comparison.
Yeah,
And in a sense, he sort of takes that for granted. Whereas Gary has had to work hard for what he's got and has a drive in him in order to do so because he hasn't come from a position of financial security. But I wonder whether that informs the way Gary feels about himself. Does he feel a certain inferiority, for example, next to her? Or I think he does in relation to her family, for example. And how does it inform what they think about the life choices they've made?
well, yeah. I mean, well, I think all of that's relevant, and it's explored by the play. That, I mean, I think each other's family's views of the other slightly leaves a mark on the relationship, as it tends to do. Relationships with in-laws can sometimes be strained for very good reason, because when you have a marriage or a long-standing relationship, when you're bringing two people together, you're bringing two worldviews and different ways of doing things together, and often two families who can be very different in outlook. So that it has inherently has its own stresses and strains. I mean, as you say, I think in their marriage there's this additional issue because although Maggie's parents originally come from fairly modest working class origins in the East End of London themselves, over the years they've really bettered themselves economically and in terms of where they live and everything in a way that Gary's parents hadn't. And so, there can be of course, within families, there can be a bit of snobbery, even if it's of the inadvertent kind rather than the malicious kind.
Well, like doesn't Gary says, doesn't he, that to Maggie that he thinks her parents look down their nose at him, essentially.
Yeah, he does, that's right. He feels that quite strongly, and he's probably right. I don't get the sense that Maggie's parents are malicious or mean in any way, but I think that they come from a very different place. These are working class people that have gradually become quite middle class. They live in a nice house. They've in an environment where their children have gone to university. They have an atmosphere of reading books and listening to Radio 4, and that couldn't be further away from the atmosphere that Gary grew up in his overcramped little ex-council house where tempers would have been flaring and people were hard up for money and all of that.
I think what's also fascinating about what you've done with these characters is you see that that affects the relationships with, say, the rest of the family, but it also affects their sense of themselves and what they've achieved or what they hope to achieve. I mean, there's a moment when Gary, I think, I think quite convincingly, really, says to Maggie, you've been so comfortable that the trouble with you is you've never had to scratch around for a few quid, so that you don't understand the drive that's fueled me to pursue the work career I have, to work all the hours I have, to provide for my family, to secure the wealth. And yet her idea about what she was going to be was not based on financial drivers. She has perhaps the luxury of a comfortable background to have other types of aspirations, as you sketch out in the play, that she has this vision of her driving around in her own VW Beetle at university and working in TV or the media, because she takes for granted that somewhere the financial necessities will just happen.
Yeah, but I don't blame her for that. I mean, no one is in control of the family that they're born into. I suppose part of what is moving, I think, about what Maggie says at the end of the play about the pain of growing up, she just never realised that life would be so hard given what her upbringing is. Why should she? And you can't blame her for that. You don't get the sense that Maggie has been spoiled in any way by her parents. And actually, if anything, you get the sense that apart from special occasions, that in her family, that were fairly modestly done. So I don't blame Maggie for that. But it's when you get two people together that are from these different class backgrounds, this stuff is going to happen. And of course, it was of interest to me because there's a lot of drama in it.
David, I think we've probably gone past the point where usually I like to stop and give our listeners a brief synopsis of the plot of the play so that anyone who doesn't know it can stay with us. But in this case, I think I'd be hard pressed to say there is much in the way of a plot to give away. I don't mean that in any way disrespectful. But for the benefit of listeners, we talked a lot about Maggie and Gary. Is there a way to very quickly summarize what happens in the play?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, Maggie tells Gary that she's not sure that she loves him, and they begin to explore that, and she realizes that Gary isn't going to just accept that. So she reveals that she thinks that she's in love with someone else, which is obviously a massive thing to confide. And they kind of wrestle with that. And Gary, I think, believes that that's it, that the marriage is over, and he's very upset and hurt. So he smashes some things up in the kitchen. And I think that that's really shocking. And he says, there's no point. She asks him why he's done that. And he says, there's no point because she's leaving. And she doesn't answer. So we think, oh, what's going on there? Why hasn't she agreed? So, Gary decides then to make a kind of an attempt to win her back because I suppose he knows that what she's always loved about him is his ability to charm her and make her laugh. And he does that by dicking around to their song, maybe their wedding dance song. And that doesn't work, which is a real shock. It's like, well, maybe she is really going. And so he decides he's not got anything to lose. And so he puts on the table all of his unhappiness, having heard hers earlier. And that's a bit of a shock to her, I think. And he sort of starts, I think, to reach a bit of acceptance that, well, this is it. But then Maggie says to him, if she'd said she was leaving him, she would have said. So then Gary thinks, oh, so this isn't over. And so then Gary thinks, I've got to try and get to the bottom of this in some way that we haven't done before. What's at the root of all of this? And so he says to her, what do you want? I want to understand you. So Maggie talks about the thing that's been on her mind a lot in the last few months as she's been trying to weigh up her life, which is this thing we were just talking about, which is how she had such a happy childhood and had everything that she could want in a way. But when you encounter the adult world of disappointment, like how ill prepared she was for life in a way, because since she's been 19, forgive me, all she's had is in a way a life of ordinary ups and downs that we all have and disappointments. And then I don't want to say the rest because there might be some listeners who we've totally spoilt the whole play so far.
Well, one of the things about this podcast is it's very difficult to do any justice to a play without spoiling it. But this is a great summary so far, David. Brilliant. I love the idea about what's at the root of all this, because one of the amazing things is they're opening up in all sorts of ways that they had never talked about together before, exploring things about their relationship, but also themselves. They're revealing things and asking questions of themselves. And there's a great moment where they ask each other, which I think is the core of the play, is what do you want and what did you want? Two questions. What do they want now at this stage of their lives, and what did they originally want for their lives? Because we're in that classic midlife crisis, whatever you want to call it, kind of moment where they're asking themselves, how does my life measure up to what I imagined or hoped it would be? Is this a time of life thing for you, or something you observed from other people you know about this kind of examination?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, I think that both Gary and Maggie have had these kind of dreams or myths of what they want their life to be like we all do. Gary's idea was that he was going to have 3 or 4 kids and in a way be the kind of working class made good paterfamilias. He was going to be that guy who was going to be out there in his big garden doing the barbecue with 3 or 4 kids running around and all the family there and all that. And Maggie had a different idea about what her life was going to be like. I suppose her life went in a direction she didn't expect because she met Gary. So I think Maggie would probably say, that he wasn't the sort of guy she was looking for. He was someone who kind of walked into her life. Like, I think if Maggie was asked, she'll have had a type that she'll have gone for. And she talks about it in the play, about these city boys with loafers 2 nights a week in a titty bar. These guys, these rich traders and brokers who probably quite good looking, but bad boys. And you get the sense that Maggie, well, she says in the play, had not had much luck with men. And then she met Gary. And although he did that job as well, Gary's a broker in the city. He put his arm around her and said he was going to look after her the first time he met her. And he has.
Yeah, he's a nice guy.
So life has given them different things. I just want to pedal back though as well to this thing that's come up about whether there's much story or not in the play. And I think that in the first 2 pages of the play, a woman who's been with a guy for 16 years tells him she doesn't love him anymore. And as my friend Dan Rabalato says, what do you want? A car chase?
Yeah.
Play is full of story. I think the thing is that there's sometimes an expectation that what plot or story means is a murder in the village. And that's not the case. Within the context of this play, if you think about the summary that I've just given of the turning points in the action of the play is full of story, but it's story that hinges upon the domestic and the emotional.
Yes.
Rather than a big BBC One Sunday night handbrake turn.
Yeah. Touche to Dan and to you, David.
No. It's important that we define our terms, I think. And I say this as a teacher of playwriting as much as an author here. I think what we're talking about is a different kind of story.
Definitely.
But back to the thing about dreams, of course, the gap between what a character's dreams are and what the reality of their life is, it's the stuff of drama. It's what makes Arthur Miller great. It's what makes Chekhov great. And it's always been a fertile place for a dramatist. That gap that exists between what someone wanted their whole life and what the reality of their life is now. And definitely Middle really, really rose into that.
Yes, it's all about that gap. What's fascinating is where do they get their ideas for what that dream or myth should be in the first place?
Yeah.
So as you say, Maggie had some different ideas. there's some kind of trade-off between some ideas she had about romance and adventure and security. There's some sense that she says to herself, or to him even, that she may have settled for someone or something she shouldn't have, that she's compromised because he offered her safety as opposed to adventure, or she'd been in love with someone else and had her heart broken. And Gary was somewhat on the rebound, but also a different kind of person who would look after her and has looked after her. And then Gary's dreams come, as we said earlier, more from where he came from financially and what he therefore needed to achieve that would make him happy. And what makes him happy now is family and being at home and his daughter. He wanted more of a family, as you said. He wanted more children. Maggie didn't want more children. For the most part, that part of his life's happy, but he's had to compromise with work because he's had to do a job he no longer obviously loves and works with people he doesn't really like or get along with. And that's a sacrifice he's made. But and then for the idea that the home might be blown up, boy, that would be terrible for him, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not just taking apart the material circumstances of his life. That would be like a hammer blow to his whole identity, I think. His identity is so wrapped up in the idea of going to work and then being the family man and all that. Whether that self-image is entirely accurate might be a point of debate, because we find in the play that Maggie has felt very alone, particularly as a parent. It's incredibly important, that aspect of the play, what they wanted and what they've actually got. And I think it's why it's important, the stuff about the guy that has turned Maggie's head.
Yes, John. I was going to ask you about him because when you mentioned Gary's self-image, I think there's a question about Maggie's self-image too, isn't there? Because tell us about that relationship with what is her emotional arc that's led her to that, and what's going on with that relationship with John for her.
I think that she's felt starved of attention from Gary, hasn't she? And I think what's more, she's begun to really resent it, which is the real killer, isn't it? That's where the real damage begins to be done in terms of a relationship, is that she's felt starved of a certain kind of attention, support. Gary talks about sex, but actually she's wanted a different kind of intimacy, I think.
She also has a different cultural view, though, of herself. Do you think
Yeah.
she talks about when they go to an exhibition at Tate Modern and
Yeah, that's all really important, I think, because it's some of the writing in the play that I'm most pleased with, because it's really important to allow for a moment of irony in a play like this that's really exploring the gap between what people have got and what they want and what they always wanted. Because through Maggie's infatuation with John, she can't see what the audience see and Gary sees, which is that this copper is probably a bit of a knob who just wants to shag. And she's hanging on and being agonized and all the rest of it. And she thinks it's love and all of that. And I don't say that in any cruel way about Maggie. We've all been infatuated and know what it's like. I think that that's why the audience laughs quite hard in those moments.
I think there's an element of where the audience picks up the dramatic irony in a way that there's something fantasy about the way she thinks of John. And I think one of the key lines is about sushi,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
where she talks about how John and she have gone for sushi, and Gary says to her, "But you don't like sushi." And she goes, "Well, I tried," or something. So the reality is she may not actually be cut out for this world that she thinks she's missed somehow.
Yeah, but it's just the truth of it, isn't it? 'Cause that's what infatuation is like. And I mean, that's part of, I think, Gary's wisdom, is that although he's very angry and upset about John, he sort of realizes as well that Maggie's not slept with John yet. She's reacted with silence to "I'm leaving." And then when they talk about the practicalities of her leaving, there's all this "I want time to think," and "I haven't said I'm leaving," and all this. And so Gary can see that it may be that it's possible that they could stay together. It might not be, but it may be possible, because this feels like infatuation. She says she feels like she's in love with him, but if this is all it is, it's an infatuation, then this can be got through.
Yes, it may not be real. And of course, in practical terms, we do learn that John has told her not to leave her husband,
Yeah, well, of course.
and he doesn't want to leave his family and wife. So If she had an idea of sailing off into the sunset, this isn't an option. I think that's a really nice twist that you've put in there, in the sense that we now see that part of her pain perhaps comes from the fact that John has rejected this idea, rejected her, or also that this dream that she may have had, an alternative dream, isn't possible either.
Yeah.
But when you said earlier about she has felt starved of attention and support, one of the most powerful strands, I thought, David, through the play is about Maggie being a mother and her recounting how she's lived through that, what she's felt about Annabelle, her daughter, the one daughter. In fact, she says she finds Annabelle difficult. Their relationship's difficult. Annabelle is a daddy's girl. She always ends up becoming the person who says no. She believes her daughter hates her, loves her, and hates her. She feels guilty for not being a good enough mother. And there's all that strand about the early years, about how she left work and where that left her with all the other moms stuck with her all the time. Her daughter, 5 years on my own, she said, as you said. Gary wasn't there, really. And how soul destroying that is. But as a mom, when you have to go from full on work, that's your identity. And as Maggie describes it, she finds it incredibly lonely. She's not the same person anymore, is she?
Yeah. No, I think all of it's true. I mean, it's incredibly common. I mean, for all of the fact that we are in 2022 and there are now possibilities for shared parental leave and things like that, it's a painfully familiar story that actually that what ends up happening is that in a heterosexual relationship, that by and large the woman is left holding the baby, so to speak. It's a common story, but no less important for it.
Oh yeah, I think it's deadly, the way she describes it, isn't it? That she's cut off from an adult world and doing all the things that gave her an identity previously. She says she was so much more than that.
Yeah, she says I was so much more than a mum and a wife. But, I mean, it's hard for someone like Gary to understand because, when Maggie was trying to cope and saying to him, "No, I'm all right, Gary, don't worry, get to work," he'll have accepted that all at face value and just not explored too much further. Maybe because on some level there's an awareness of, your guilt isn't troubled then, is it? You can just carry on with the working day and then go out for the drinks. Despite the fact that your wife or your partner looks like they're about to fall over, they're so unhappy. If they're being brave and saying, I'm all right, then it's much easier to just go, I'm going to take that at face value and get out of the door and go to work.
And he also believes that's his role. That's what he's contributing, is he's going to earn the money to buy the house that they live in, and to give the daughter, the daughter goes to private school and wants for nothing, as he would say.
Yeah, but I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't think he's a character who would have been completely insensitive to all of that unhappiness. I think it's right what he says, that they're talking about conversations they've never had. He says at one point, "Why have you never talked to me about this?" I think they are all new conversations and they're upsetting for it. But I just think that, like, there's a moment in the play where Gary says, "You had your mates." Thank God I did. And I think you can almost see there a trace of the past conversations where Gary will have been out the door to get to work in the morning while Maggie's been up all night with the baby, and he said, "You all right?" And she'll have said, "Yeah, it's all right. What are you doing today?" She said, "Oh, well, I'm going to go and walk around Wild Park with Jessie and her little girl today. Don't worry, Gary, I'll be all right."
And to Gary, that sounds fine.
Then that sounds fine.
This lack of understanding is two-way, isn't it? Because as you said earlier, Gary spends the second part of the play, in a way, we learn more about his perspective and talking about how he's not been happy about himself or where he's got to, particularly with his work. But one of the things I kept thinking through the play, David, is she says, particularly several times, she wants to talk. We want to talk. And one of my favorite lines she says at one point is, "We give each other instructions. We make arrangements." That hit home. I bet everybody in the audience went, "Oh, yeah, that's what we do." But why don't they talk? I mean, all this stuff inside them, why don't they say any of this?
It's fear, isn't it? I think it's like your life is so full, you're busy, you've got young children, and there's a fear that if you open, it's like opening Pandora's box. If you say, "I don't feel that happy about this," that it can quickly lead on to, "I'm not happy," and then it can quickly lead on to having an argument because maybe the other person in the marriage or relationship feels threatened. And I think it's quite common in relationships, that there's a fear of saying something. Like, everyone knows that the healthy thing to do in a relationship is to talk about things as you go along before they become too big. But there's a fear of saying whatever that thing is, that it's going to lead to a argument or upset. And when you've got a busy, full life with young children, that's a genuine concern, isn't it? If you're both knackered because you've both been at work, you've just got the children in bed, you've managed to have some food, you're in front of, I don't know, Great British Bake Off, with your feet up and a glass of wine each. Do I really want to raise the topic that I'm feeling a bit resentful about at the moment? Or do I want to have another sip of my wine? I think in reality, that's it. And I mean, the sadness with Maggie and Gary is that they've got to the point where this conversation in the middle of the night, where you realise they really haven't talked properly for a few years now, actually. It's not even like a few months. A friend of mine went to see it, and he said to me, the thing that he enjoyed most about the play, actually, he said it was fascinating and cringeworthy in a good way, watching two people who haven't really talked before trying to talk to each other. Of course, they've talked in the past, but they've got to the point. It's built up certainly over the last few years, just this atmosphere. And I mean, I love that line that you refer to about we don't talk, we give each other instructions, make arrangements. I mean, it's a line to chill the hearts of anyone that's middle-aged and married, I think.
Yeah. It's too true. It's too true. I think that whether pragmatic or not, psychologically, opening the box is unpredictable. You don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah, of course.
And also, just it gives life or credence to something that you might be repressing that I don't really want to acknowledge.
Yeah.
And then there's another classic one, which is that, if you're honest, it can be hurtful. So
Yeah.
there's a great moment, isn't there, David, where Gary says complete honesty is overrated when
Yeah.
Maggie is what we might call oversharing.
Yeah.
But also, I wanted to ask you about this because I just noticed it in the published text this week. One of the epigraphs reads, "Marriage is the waste paper basket of the emotions." Why did you put that one in there as the epigraph? What do you think that means? What are we throwing into the basket here?
I think what that means is that when you're with someone for a long time, whether it's a long relationship or a marriage, I mean, interchangeable really, you become accustomed along the way to giving a lot of your emotional life that doesn't always change very much.
Okay. You mean it's the same things you're giving?
Well, no, I think that you could, so like in a way, so if you think about the action of Middle, they have this whole both ordinary and completely momentous and extraordinary conversation for an hour and 40 minutes where they both feel seriously heartbroken, and Gary smashes up all the family crockery apart from the teapot. And then at the end, Annabelle wakes up and they're going to get on with the morning. And you kind of think, well, has everything changed or has everything stayed the same? So there've been all of these emotions that in Beatrice Webb's terms have gone into the waste paper basket in a way, or possibly so. For me, that epigram has a kind of a double meaning, because on the surface it looks incredibly bleak about marriage. But actually, when you really think about what she's saying, she's just actually being brutally honest about what you expend in a long relationship or marriage emotionally. And it doesn't always move the dial. That you can end all of this feeling and emotion and you're still married to the same person.
Yeah. I also thought about it, and this is maybe too literal, was that it's a container, a marriage, in some respects, for the worst of our emotions,
Yeah, that's right.
which the outside world doesn't see. It's the mistakes of the first draft or whatever that we chuck into the bin.
Yeah,
Because I've said all my life, no one knows what really goes on in between two people in a marriage,
yeah, I agree.
and that they can throw all that stuff in the wastebasket and not be what you see in public. But it's a fascinating one. You mentioned about where are they when they get to the end of this conversation. And of course, I know, David, you are not going to answer this question because the play is deliberately not answering this question, is it? But where are they? Where are they going? As Maggie says, if this is the end, is this the beginning of the end? And Gary argues, of course, this isn't the end for us. No way. We've not even got anywhere near the end of the road. This is the middle. So, is this the beginning of the end or just a middle point on the way to who knows what? What's the future?
Well, the audience have to decide with this play, just like they did about Danny and Laura and Beginning. So Beginning is set in autumn 215, and when the play was produced at the Dorfman, it was produced 2 years later. So the audience is going at the end of Beginning, well, 2 years on from that night, did they fuck on the sofa and then get up hungover in the morning, and then Danny went home and they never saw each other again? Or now, as we're watching this play, are Danny and Laura a couple with a baby? And that's the question of the play. And similarly with Middle, I can't answer that question. I don't know the answer myself. Well, I can answer one question, which is I think that they obviously stay together because it's called Middle. I think that the real question is should they have stayed together? So the real question for an audience is their marriage going to improve because of this conversation? Yeah. So 2 years on, are they happier because of that night where they bared their souls? Or are 2 years on, they still in the same place? Maybe just with even more scar tissue and more hardening of the shell, because there was a kind of a wound opened, wasn't there, that night? And then having closed it back up, there's a lot of scar. Sorry for the crappy mixed metaphors here, but so that's the real question. I mean, I think, yeah, they probably are still together because the play's called Middle. But that's not the question for the audience, actually. The question is, has this conversation been worth it? Has it changed anything?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that, of course.
That's what people talk about in the bar.
Exactly, but it's not meant to be answered in a sense. It's not didactic, this play. And it is just the end of one conversation, and there'll have to be other conversations of whatever kind between them. And I love the whole idea that you've just described, that the morning's coming, the day will start, Annabelle's getting up, has to go to football practice. Certain things have a momentum of their own that just have to keep going. And how do they respond and react to that? Because, of course, Annabelle is this unseen presence throughout, but very powerful for it. Because, of course, the question always hanging there is, what do we tell her? How are we behaving in front of her? How can we sleep in separate bedrooms and explain that? All those things have to be thought about or addressed. So there's way too much unanswered still. I wanted to ask you one last thing, which was the impact you wanted to have from writing this play. And I don't know whether as a playwright you think this is the impact I want to make, but humor me for a minute.
Yeah.
You talked about what happens in the bar afterwards. So as I sat watching the signs of unhappiness between them and things, I was wondering, of course, how many men and women in the audience were recognizing themselves and being prompted to look at themselves in a way they haven't before. And I was reminded, I did a podcast on A Doll's House, and during the conversation of that, or the research for that, I discovered that there was an actress who played Nora in a production of A Doll's House at the Young Vic. And then Nora, of course, is famous for being a woman who is so unhappy in her marriage and life that she walks out on her husband and children. And the actress said that she'd heard stories from cast members of people they knew in the audience who made the decision to leave their partner having seen this show. What sort of impact do you expect your play to have in that sort of context?
I mean, I wouldn't wish for that kind of impact necessarily,
No, no.
but I think that the theatre can have that impact. I mean, when I saw Patrick Marber's Closer in the Cottesloe, as it was then in 1997, I went with my girlfriend at the time and we split right up on the upper ground after the play.
No.
And I definitely think seeing the play had something to do with that brief argument that led quite quickly to you know. But I think that definitely people have been saying to me and others that it's made them reflect upon where they are with their life, which I think is probably quite a coded and diplomatic way of answering your question. I had a private message from someone on Instagram that had seen the show over the weekend, and someone who was a complete stranger to me. And this woman said how much the play had touched her and that it really gave her pause to take stock of her life. And I think that that's great because, I mean, you'll probably remember before from beginning, Doug, that one of my touchstones is John Osborne's idea that you try and give an audience a lesson in feeling.
Uh-huh.
And that's really, really what I want to do. And so if the play can really not just make an audience laugh and cry and think, but can just really somehow get under the rib cage and knock about a bit in terms of what's really essential for someone, then I think that the play has really done its job to give people pause to take stock in that way. In a way, that's the best thing anyone could possibly say to me about the play. This stranger writing to me on Instagram. As the author of this play, I can't hope for any more than that.
I wasn't prescribing action there. I don't think you are, obviously. And in fact, it goes back to that question you asked about, whether their conversation is a good or bad thing. In fact, I think you have to come away thinking conversation's got to be a good thing. That examination is a good thing. That the unexamined is the problem.
Yeah.
And that's what you're doing. You're examining, and it may lead others to do that as well. Okay, well, David, fantastic. We've run over time as usual. I knew we would. I can't let you go before one other thing. As you may remember from the first time we spoke, that one of the traditions of the podcast, I like to ask my guest to recommend another play, partly because I just love to hear what plays they love and what you would recommend, or maybe we even talk about it in the future episode. So have you got a second play that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. So I would like to recommend another Robert Holman play. So I'd like to recommend Robert Holman's final play, The Lodger. Robert sadly died in December, just before Christmas, and I've thought a lot about him. When I first met Robert in 1998, I got introduced to him at a party at the Hampstead Theatre, and I was an embarrassing, drunk young playwright who was being a bit of a fan. We got to know each other, and then gradually, he was like a mentor, and then gradually we became friends, and then we wrote a play together with Simon Stevens, and we felt like peers. But anyway, in I think it was 2013 or 2014, he wrote the first version of The Lodger, and I remember he sent it to me. And I remember reading Robert's play in bed and just literally reading it with my mouth open. It was so wonderful. And then I got to the last page and I made myself some coffee, and then I read it again right away from beginning to end. And I absolutely loved it. When the play was produced at the Coronet in the autumn, I think through no fault of the play's own, Robert was ill in his final illness then. And because of COVID and everything, he didn't attend many rehearsals. And so he wasn't able to have the input on a first production that's really important from a playwright. So I think that the production, while it wasn't a bad production, it didn't necessarily fully represent that play, if I can put it like that. So I would really, really recommend to people to read The Lodger. It is a really, really wonderful, wonderful play. And it has got some of the best writing for two sparring middle-aged women, certainly up there with Ibsen's John Gabriel Borkman.
That's a great choice. I did see that production at the Coronet, and I came away, like you just said, just dazzled by the quality, the beauty of the writing. And I will hunt it out now to read it. Thank you for that, David. Great suggestion. And thank you for your time today, for coming back and talking about Middle. And thank you for Middle. And we very much look forward to End. And of course, I will call you when End comes out. And I hope we will be able to do this conversation again. So thanks very much. Great to see you.
No, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Doug.
As the play draws towards its end, the end of this particular conversation between Maggie and Gary, it will be morning and another day will start with the question of their futures unresolved. This is just a moment in the middle, or perhaps even muddle, of their lives, which can and will go anywhere from here. This shared moment may be a step forward for them simply because they know more about each other and themselves than they did before they talked. By their opening up, they give themselves a better chance of addressing their mutual challenges, perhaps, and at the very least, of gaining an understanding from which empathy and forgiveness will come, if necessary. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.